It was the last night of January, 1968, in the old imperial capital of Vietnam, a city called Hue, folded around a slow green river, asleep in the middle of the biggest holiday of its year. Fog lay on the water. Incense smoke hung in the family shrines. For 150 years, this had been the one city the war agreed to walk around. The sacred city, the museum city, the place both sides had quietly spared. At 20 minutes to 4 in the morning, a flare rose over the river, and rockets began to fall on the new town. And in the streets of the sleeping city, thousands of soldiers who had walked in through the holiday crowds, in ordinary clothes, one traveler at a time, rose from their hiding places and took Hue in a single night. By dawn, a strange flag hung over the fortress of the emperors, from the tallest flagstaff in the country. It would fly there for 24 days. The fight to bring it down would run for the better part of a month, through the hardest city fighting Americans had faced in a generation. And an ocean away, it would quietly change how a nation felt about the whole war. This is the complete story of that battle. Street by street, wall by wall, in the rain, from the first rocket to the morning the flag came down. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. Videos like this one take weeks to research and build, and that one small click genuinely keeps the watch going. Now, get comfortable, let the rain settle in over the river, and let's go back, before any of it happened, to the city as it was. But before that night, before the flares stood up over the water, before a strange flag hung from the tower at dawn, there was simply a city. And to understand what those weeks took away, you have to see it first in daylight, in peacetime, the way it had stood for the better part of 2 centuries. Hue lies in the narrow waste of Vietnam, in Thu Thien province, where the country tightens to a thin band of lowland between the mountains and the sea. It was, in 1968, home to something like 140,000 people, the third city of the South. But size was never the point of Hue. Its importance was older and quieter than that. This was the imperial capital, the old heart of the country, and everyone in Vietnam knew it. The city had been the seat of the Nguyen dynasty, the last emperors of Vietnam, since the first years of the 1800s. For the century and a half that followed, it was the cultural and spiritual capital of Vietnam, the place of the court and the mandarins, the poets and scholars, the royal tombs along the river, the Buddhist pagodas whose bells carried across the water at dawn. If a Vietnamese city could be said to hold the soul of the nation, this was the one people would name. And at its heart stood the citadel. The citadel, the Vietnamese called it Kinh Thon, was a fortress city, and it was enormous. The first Nguyen emperors had spent the better part of 3 decades building it, laying out a great square, each side more than 2 kilometers long, and raising walls in the European manner, the star fort design of the French engineer Vauban, all angled bastions and earthworks. These were not thin castle walls. They were ramparts of packed earth faced in brick and stone, standing 2 and 3 times the height of a man, and so broad at the base, thick enough in places to drive along the top, that no gun of the last century's wars could have hoped to breach them. Around the whole square ran a moat more than 20 meters wide. Inside that outer wall waited another wall, and inside that, a third. The citadel held rings within rings. Within the fortress stood the imperial city, with its own walls and gates, and within the imperial city, at the very center of everything, lay the forbidden purple city, Tukamthan, the innermost sanctum, where once only the emperor, his family, and his servants could set foot. It was Vietnam's answer to the forbidden city of Beijing, a palace within a citadel within a city, folded one inside the next like the layers of something precious kept under glass. That is the truest way to picture Old Hue, not as a fortress braced for war, but as a thing kept under glass, a museum with people living inside it. The throne rooms and the tombs, the lotus moats and the courtyards, the tiled roofs going green with age. For 150 years the city had been less a stronghold than a reliquary, and the country had treated it that way. Through the middle of it ran the river, the perfume river, the Huang, curved through Hui and split it cleanly in two. On the north bank stood the citadel and the old city, the imperial ground. On the south bank spread the newer city, the quarter built up in the French colonial years, the university, the hospital, the provincial offices, the market streets, the villas along the water. A bridge carried the road across the river and stitched the two halves together. Two cities really, old and new, facing each other across a slow green river. One the memory of Vietnam, the other its present. And here is the strange, tender fact at the center of everything that followed. The war had left Hue almost entirely alone. For years, as the fighting ground across the rest of the country, the old capital had stayed a kind of island. There was no great garrison inside it, no ring of bunkers, no serious fortification manned and ready for battle. By an unspoken understanding, both sides had largely spared the city. Too sacred, too beautiful, too much the shared inheritance of all Vietnamese to be fought over. Soldiers passed through it. Convoys rolled along its highway. But the war itself seemed to hold its breath and step around Hue, the way you might walk quietly around a museum, the way you lower your voice without being told. For a century and a half the city had been a museum the war walked around. That was its blessing. It would also, in the last days of January, become the reason no one was ready. Because it was Tet Nguyen Don, the Lunar New Year, is the great festival of Vietnam, the most important days on the whole calendar, the time when families gather and the country comes home. For the holiday, a truce had been declared, as it was declared every year, a pause in the war, so that both sides could observe the new year. Across South Vietnam, many soldiers of the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, had been released on leave to be with their families. In Hue especially, a city at peace and a country at war, the garrison was thin and the mood was easy. The markets were full. The streets were crowded with visitors home for the holiday. Everyone had let their guard down, because that is what the holiday was for. But look at the map around the sleeping city, and you can already see the shape of what was coming. Running north and south through Hue was Highway 1, Route 1, the great spinal road of Vietnam, the country's single most important artery, carrying everything and everyone between the north and the south. It came up from the coast, crossed the river on that one bridge, and ran on toward the demilitarized zone, the line that split the two Vietnams, some 50 kilometers to the north. Da Nang lay about 50 miles down the same road to the south. Along that highway, a handful of small outposts held the American and South Vietnamese presence. About 8 miles south of the city sat the Marine base at Phu Bai, headquarters of a unit called Task Force X-Ray, the nearest real reserve of American strength. In the new city itself, a block and a half south of the river and just off the east side of the highway, stood a walled compound, the headquarters of the American Military Advisors. The MACV compound, a couple of hundred men at most, and 17 kilometers up the highway to the northwest lay a camp the French had once numbered PK-17, where a pair of battalions of the South Vietnamese 1st Division and a battalion of paratroopers were quartered. From there, when the time came, the first relief column would set out. That was the board on the last night of January 1968. An open city, a sacred one, all but undefended in the middle of its own great holiday. A thin scatter of soldiers along a single highway. A slow river with one bridge, and a fortress with walls a century and a half old that no one had built to stop a war, because the war had always before agreed to stay away. It would not stay away this time. If the war was coming to Hue, it did not come the way war usually announces itself, with columns on the horizon, with engines and dust. It came quietly, on foot, in ordinary clothes, and the city let it in itself, mistaking it for guests. To see how, you have to know who was already inside the city that January, and who was walking toward it through the dark. The man responsible for Hue was a South Vietnamese general named Ngo Quang Truong. He commanded the 1st Division of the ARVN, and he was, by wide agreement on every side, one of the finest field commanders the South ever produced. Lean, soft-spoken, undramatic, and very hard to surprise. His headquarters sat in the northeastern corner of the citadel, in a small walled post called Mang Ka, a compound within the fortress, an old citadel within a citadel, that the 1st Division used as its command center. Around Truong was the working body of a division headquarters, staff officers, signalers, guards, and one unit that mattered out of all proportion to its size. The division kept an elite reconnaissance company, all volunteers, perhaps 240 men, who went by the name Hak Bao, the Black Panthers. They were Truong's personal reserve, his fire brigade, the men he sent to the hardest corner of any fight. Keep them in mind. Before the first night was over, that single company would be much of what stood between the enemy and the whole northern half of the city. Across the river, on the south bank, sat the other pillar of the Allied presence, the MACV compound. This was the home of the American military advisors attached to the South Vietnamese forces around Hue. A walled block of buildings just off the highway, holding fewer than 200 men, advisors and staff, with a handful of Australians among them. They were not a combat garrison. They were officers and sergeants who worked alongside the Vietnamese by day. By night they would find themselves cut off, holding a perimeter they had never expected to defend, waiting for someone to reach them. That was the Allied city, a thin, capable garrison in the citadel, a scatter of advisors across the river, and a holiday emptiness over everything. Now the other side. The force gathering against Hue was not a raiding party. At its core were 2 regular regiments of the North Vietnamese Army, the People's Army of Vietnam, the 4th and the 6th, hardened main force infantry, together with local Viet Cong battalions and battalions of combat engineers, the sappers. The 6th Regiment was to take the citadel and the old city on the north bank. The 4th was to take the new city and the advisors' quarter on the south. Behind them stood an artillery regiment to open the way with rockets and mortars. How many men in all is a question no one could answer cleanly, then or now. The first wave alone ran to something like 10,000. At least 2 regiments, 2 sapper battalions, and the local forces. And behind the first wave, the command had gathered more. By the reckoning of the Marine Corps' own students of the battle, 15 to 18 battalions were committed to Hugh before it was over. And the precise number was something no one on the Allied side knew. That, it would turn out, was the whole problem. Because the astonishing thing about this army was not its size. It was that so much of it walked into Hugh in plain sight. For months before Tet, the work had been going on quietly. Agents mapped the city. Weapons and ammunition were carried in a little at a time and hidden, cached in safe houses inside the walls, stockpiled in the mountain base areas to the west. And in the days before the holiday, as Hugh filled with travelers coming home for Tet, pilgrims, traders, families, the ordinary swelling crowd of the greatest festival of the year, soldiers came in among them in civilian clothes, carrying their weapons broken down and hidden, memorizing the streets they would fight in a week later. This is the quiet center of the whole story. Hugh did not have its gates stormed. Hugh opened them over and over for weeks to a crowd it took for holiday guests. And a part of that crowd was its own siege, walking and smiling, one traveler at a time. The city welcomed its enemy the way a house welcomes visitors on a feast day, and never counted them, because you do not count your guests. The Allies, for their part, badly misjudged what was assembling. Intelligence around Hugh was thin, and the early estimates of enemy strength in the area were low. On the order of 8,000, a figure that would only be revised upward to perhaps 12,000 after the fighting had already begun. The enemy's own intelligence, by contrast, was detailed and accurate. They knew the ground and the garrison well. One side had studied the other closely. The other had barely looked. And because the Allied command kept underestimating what it faced, it would feed its reinforcements into the city a little at a time. Piecemeal, a company here, a company there, always a step behind the true size of the thing. The reinforcements, when they came, would come mostly from one place. That Marine base 8 miles down the highway at Phu Bai. There, only weeks earlier, on the 13th of January, the Marines had stood up a forward headquarters called Task Force X-Ray, under a brigadier general named Foster LaHue. Its job was to hold Phu Bai, to cover the western approaches to Hugh, and to keep Highway 1 open through the region. On paper, that sounds like strength. In truth, Task Force X-Ray on the eve of Tet was stretched to the limit, a handful of understrength battalions scattered across a wide sector. The men who would fight their way into Hugh were far fewer than anyone would guess from the size of the battle they were walking into. 2 of those battalions carry the story. There was the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. They rode it 1/1 under Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Gravel, a battalion so spread out that in the first days at Hugh, Gravel could put his hands on only about 2 of his companies. And there was the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 2-5, which had reached Phu Bai on the 15th of January under Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Cheatham, a big, deliberate man, once a professional football player, whose battalion would end up with perhaps 3 companies in the city. At the start, there was no fist, only fingers, fed into the city one at a time. Understrength companies pushed up the highway in pieces. So this was the board, on the last night of the old year. A thin, first-rate garrison in the fortress. a handful of advisors across the river, a scatter of tired, understrength marine companies 8 miles to the south, and already inside the walls, mingling with the festival crowd, sleeping in safe houses, watching the streets, an army the city had welcomed without ever seeing, waiting for a single flare to stand up over the river. They did not have long to wait. Turn back one more time then, to the last ordinary days, to the look and the feel and the smell of the city in the week before anything happened. Because to know Hugh only as a battlefield is to know it wrongly. First, it was a place where people lived, in a particular weather, going about a particular life. That is the Hugh worth lingering in. Start with the sky. Because in Hugh that winter the sky was almost a presence in the room. The season had its own name. The people of northern and central Vietnam call it the kraken, the drizzle, the long gray spell that comes down with the northeast monsoon in the last weeks of winter. It is not a storm. It is something slower and more patient. A fine, endless mist of rain. A low, unbroken ceiling of cloud. Fog lying in the streets at dawn. And day after day of flat gray light with no sun behind it. The rain had begun on the night of the 30th of January. And from the 2nd of February onward, the kraken settled over Hugh and stayed, low and wet and gray, for most of the weeks to come. Hold on to that sky because it will matter more than any general. A ceiling that low, a visibility that poor, meant that the aircraft and the spotter planes and the observed artillery, the great overwhelming advantage the Americans carried into every battle, would be grounded or blinded for most of the fight. The weather took the war's most powerful weapons off the table and left men to face each other on the ground, rifle against wall, at the range of a thrown stone. The gray sky over Hugh was, in its silent way, a kind of third army on the field, and from the first day, without a word, it seemed to have chosen a side. Down beneath that ceiling, the cold was the kind that has no drama in it and never quite lets go. Not a freezing cold, not frost. Hugh does not freeze, but a raw, wet, clinging chill that finds its way under wet cloth and stays there. The men who fought in those streets would remember being cold and soaked for days on end, sleeping in wet gear in the shells of buildings, never fully drying out. It was a weather that wore people down slowly, without a single dramatic blow. The kind of cold you can still feel in the memory of it 50 years later. And the light. The kraken gives a strange, even, shadowless light. No sun to cast an edge, everything lit the same dull silver. The wet brick of the old walls gone dark with rain. The river the color of pewter, the far bank fading off into mist. It is a quiet kind of beauty, the beauty of a place seen through gauze. In photographs from those weeks, the whole city looks half dissolved in gray, soft at every edge, as if it were already turning into a memory of itself. Now put people back into it, the way it was just before. There was the market, Dong Bao, the great bazaar of Hugh, hard against the northeastern wall of the citadel, down on the bank of the river. On an ordinary morning it was the loud beating heart of the city. Fish and rice and vegetables, cloth and baskets and cooking smoke, the noise of 1,000 small transactions, boats nosing into the quay off the Perfume River. Threaded all through the old city and around the fortress ran the water, a web of canals, and the wide lotus moats that circled the citadel walls, still and green, where in season the lotus opened over the surface. Boats on the river, water in the moats, the slow pulse of a river town going about its day. The days themselves had a shape you could set a clock by. Before first light, the sampan slid down to the market quay with the night's catch, lamps swinging gently at their bows, and the bells of the pagodas carried across the water the way they had for 200 years. By mid-morning, the mist thinned into that flat silver light, and the streets filled with bicycles and school uniforms, and the smell of soup stalls. In the evening, the light went early under the low cloud. The lamps came on along the water, and the river carried the sounds of the town. A motor, a voice, a radio somewhere, long after dark. It was an ordinary rhythm, repeated so long that no one heard it anymore. It was about to become the thing everyone remembered. And over all of it, that week, lay the festival. It was Tet, the New Year, and the city had dressed for it the way it did every year. In the markets and the houses were the flowers of the season, branches of yellow apricot blossom, the Mai that means the New Year through the center and the south, and peach, and whatever else could be coaxed into bloom for the holiday. There was the food of Tet, the thick square rice cakes, ban chung, wrapped in green leaves, sweets and fruit set out for guests and for ancestors. There was the smell of incense in the pagodas and the family shrines. And there were the firecrackers, strings of them, and fireworks in the night, the old holiday noise that drives off the last year's bad luck and welcomes the new. Hold that last detail gently, because it has a shadow in it. On the night the war came, the first distant thuds and cracks of the opening bombardment reached a city that had been setting off firecrackers for days. And for a few moments here and there, people heard the beginning of the battle and thought only that someone, somewhere, was still celebrating. The sound of the festival and the sound of the guns were, for one blurred moment, the very same sound. That was the life of the place in its last ordinary hours. The note of a pagoda bell across the water, the putter of a boat motor, the crackle of holiday fireworks, the hum of the market. A warm, wet, gray, crowded, peaceful town in the middle of its dearest holiday. And then, over the days that followed, all of that would be pressed down into another kind of quiet altogether. The market shuttered and broken, the boats gone from the river, the streets empty under the drizzle, and only the far crackle of rifle fire and the drip of water off broken eaves where the noise of the festival had been. The same city, quiet twice over, first with the hush of the holiday, and then with the hush that comes after. But that was still a few hours away. On the last night of January, the city slept in the rain, its soldiers thinned out on leave, its markets full of flowers, its guests bedded down in 100 houses, the fog lying soft on the perfume river, and the lotus moats holding their still black water. Somewhere out in that fog, watches were being set to the same minute. Somewhere a man was waiting to send a single flare up into the low gray sky. And when it rose, the city would wake into a different world. The last real sound of the old year had been celebration. All through the evening of the 30th, Hugh had kept the Tet he'd always kept. Incense on the family tables and firecrackers snapping in the wet streets. That small, bright noise a city makes to frighten off the bad luck of the year behind it. And so when the first rockets rose in the dead hour before dawn, in the dark and the river fog, a great many people in Hugh did not sit up in alarm. For a few seconds the sound was not yet war. It was only more of the festival. Then it did not stop. In the last black hour before dawn on the 31st of January, a flare climbed over the city, and behind it came the barrage. a salvo of rockets from the North Vietnamese gunners, falling on the new town south of the river. It was the opening of a bombardment, and it was also a signal. All across Hue at once, on both banks, men who had waited months for this hour rose from their hiding places and moved on the targets they had already learned by heart. There were perhaps 10 battalions of them in that first wave. The corps of 2 North Vietnamese regiments, the 4th and the 6th, thickened with local Viet Cong battalions and companies of combat engineers. Most had come into the city the slow way over the preceding weeks in ordinary clothes, folded into the crowds of pilgrims and traders and homecoming families that flowed into Hue for Tet. They had studied these streets. They knew which gate, which wall, which building each of them was to take, and at the signal, they took them. This was not a raid. The blow was planned to the scale of a division and timed almost to the minute across the whole city. And the men who delivered it knew the ground better than many of the men defending it, where the headquarters were, where the advisors slept, which bridges mattered. Their commanders had studied Hue for months. The side that owned the city on paper had, by comparison, badly underestimated how many soldiers were now inside it. On the north bank, the weight of the blow fell on the citadel. Battalions of the 6th Regiment came against the great western wall, driving for the airfield inside the fortress and for the one corner they wanted most, the compound at Mong Ca in the northeast, where the South Vietnamese 1st Division kept its headquarters. Others pushed through a northern gate, took a bridge over the moat, and worked inward through the sleeping lanes of the old town. Within the walls, building by building, the ancient capital began to change hands. South of the Perfume River, in the new town, the 4th Regiment did the same. Its battalions moved up from the outskirts through the modern quarter of markets and offices and villas, while other units swung wide to the west of the city and took the villages astride the roads, closing as they went the very approaches by which help might come. By the small hours, the whole grid of Hue, north bank and south, was filling with soldiers who did not belong to it. For the people of the city, it was a night with almost nothing to see. The fog and drizzle that had rolled in the night before lay over the river and the streets, and the fighting was mostly a thing of sound. The flat crack of the rockets, then small arms fire, opening from a dozen directions at once, echoing off stone walls and shuttered fronts. Families who had gone to bed inside a festival woke into a city that no longer answered to anyone they knew, and they stayed behind their doors and waited for the morning to explain itself. One man had not been caught sleeping. Brigadier General Ngo Quang Truong, who commanded the 1st Division from Mong Ca, had learned the day before that the Tet truce was cancelled, and he had not trusted it in any case. That night he kept his headquarters under arms. As the rockets fell, he already had his best card in play. The Hoc Bao, the division's elite reconnaissance company, the men they called the Black Panthers. He had sent their platoons out into the dark to hold the points that mattered. They took up positions at the province headquarters, the power station, the prison, the gates of the citadel, and Truong kept one platoon back at the airfield as a fire brigade to throw at whatever broke. It was a thin hand of cards against 10 battalions, but it meant that when the assault came, some of the key points of Hue were already held and did not simply fall in the dark to men who knew exactly where to go. So the northeast corner did not fall. All around it, the citadel was going under. The flag tower, the palace grounds, the long residential lanes, But as Mang saw the divisional staff and the Black Panthers fought at their own front gate and kept it, by the time the sky began to gray, General Truong still had his headquarters, his radios, and his one small corner of the fortress. He had lost almost everything else north of the river, and he knew it. Across the water, on the south bank, a second island held, and in the first minutes, it held on almost nothing. The compound of the American advisors, the MACV compound, was a walled block set a block and a half from the river. When a reinforced company of engineers came for it, the first thing that stopped them was a single machine gunner up on a watchtower and a handful of men in a bunker at the gate. They broke the first rush. A stronger push came in from the east a little later, and it too was held. The advisors kept their walls, and over the citadel, sometime in that first morning, the other side raised its flag. On the tall tower above the southern gate, the flagstaff that faces the palace and the river, the highest in the country, soldiers ran up the gold-starred banner of the National Liberation Front. From both banks of the Perfume River you could see it hanging in the wet air. It would hang there for 24 days, and it would become the single image the whole battle turned on. So this was Hugh at first light on the 31st of January. The city had changed hands in a single night. Nearly all of it, the citadel, the new town, the bridges, the markets, belonged now to the men who had come in for Tet and stayed. Against all of that, the Allies held two islands, Truong's corner at Mong Ka, north of the river, and the advisors' compound at MACV, south of it. A few smaller points still flickered in the captured town. A prison held by a Black Panther platoon, a transport camp, a hotel, a boat landing on the river. But they were pockets, cut off, waiting. What no one on the Allied side yet grasped was the sheer size of what had happened. Not a raid, not a mortar attack to be shrugged off before breakfast, but a whole city taken by a division in the dark, while it slept off its festival. That understanding would come slowly, and it would come the hard way, from the south, along the highway, where the nearest help was already stirring. In the MACV compound, the machine gunner still held his small light in the captured city. Toward that light at first day, the Marines would begin to fight their way up. Help was close, on the map. About 8 miles south of Hue, down Highway 1, sat the Marine base at Phu Bai, and in it a headquarters called Task Force X-Ray, under a brigadier general named Foster LeHue. When word came that the city had been hit, the natural thing was to send a company up the road to sort it out. And that is exactly what was done. A company and then another company, because no one at Phu Bai yet understood that Hugh had been taken by a division. This was the mistake that shaped the first days. The reports were confused, the fog was down, and the assumption at headquarters was that some modest force had slipped into the city and would be cleared by nightfall. So the Marines were fed up the highway in pieces, a rifle company at a time, into a fight far larger than anyone had measured. The true size of it would not be admitted for days, and every one of those days would be paid for, on the road and in the streets. The first up the road was Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. It left Phu Bai in the middle of the morning on the 31st, under a captain named Gordon Batchelor, an understrength company, barely half its proper strength, riding and walking north into a gray drizzle. At a village on the way, it took its first sniper fire, crossed a canal, and met 4 M48 tanks coming out to join it. Then it kept going, Highway 1, toward the southern edge of the city. Highway 1 into Hugh was a straight modern road, and that was the trouble with it. It ran into the new town like a drawn line, walls and houses close on either hand, and every yard of it could be watched and shot at from cover. It was not really a road anymore so much as a corridor. A mile of open lane with an enemy in the buildings down both sides. To go up, it was to be looked at the whole way. At the edge of the city, the company walked into the proof of that. A force far larger than its own opened up from the flanks, automatic weapons, mortars, recoilless guns, the whoosh of rocket grenades, and Alpha Company went to ground in a ring, taking fire from more than one side at once. Bachelor was hit and badly hurt, and went on directing his men from the ground, propped on his elbows, until the strength drained out of him. Command of the company passed to his first sergeant. That first sergeant was a man named John Canley, who would one day wear the Medal of Honor himself. And it fell to him, on a shot-up road at the mouth of the city, to hold the company together and keep it moving. Bachelor would live and would be given the Navy Cross. It was the pattern of the whole road, set on the very first morning. The commanders went down, and the column kept crawling forward under whoever was left standing. For the men in that column, it was a strange, close kind of fighting. Nothing like the open country most of them had trained for. The enemy was not out in front, but all around and above, in upper windows, on rooftops, behind garden walls, and the road gave almost nowhere to hide. Movement came in short rushes from one scrap of cover to the next. A wall, a stalled truck, the flank of a tank. You went forward a few yards, and stopped, and went again, and the mile did not seem to get any shorter. One of the platoon commanders in that column was a sergeant named Alfredo Gonzalez. Freddie to his Marines, 21 years old, from Edinburgh, Texas. On that first day, near a hamlet south of the city, he moved his platoon forward under heavy fire and quieted the snipers holding it up, clearing the way ahead. When a Marine riding a tank was hit and fell in the open, Gonzalez went out into the fire and carried him back to cover and took wounds of his own in the doing of it. Then he led his men on along a rice paddy and knocked out a machine gun with grenades. That was one day of it. Over the next few days, Gonzalez did not stop. On the 3rd of February, he was wounded again, worse this time, and refused to be evacuated, and stayed with his platoon. On the 4th, when the company was pinned by fire from a strongly held building, he worked from position to position with a light anti-tank rocket, knocking out one enemy gun after another, until he had silenced the point that had his men pinned down, and was killed doing it. He was 21. The Medal of Honor was given to his family the following year, and years after that the Navy named a destroyer for him. Behind Alpha came help of its own. Golf Company of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, started up the same road later that morning, ran into a fresh North Vietnamese battalion on the way, and fought through to reach it. Over the whole relief, the command fell to a lieutenant colonel named Marcus Gravel. By the early afternoon, the Marines had done the first hard thing. They had reached the MACV compound, the little island of advisors on the south bank. And for a while, the highway behind them was open enough to carry the wounded back out. Inside those walls, the men who had held the gate since the small hours had a strange half-mourning of it. The fighting a few streets away had barely paused, and now, out of the same gray drizzle that had hidden the attack, came Marines. The two islands of the first night were no longer quite so alone. It might have felt like the worst was over. It was not. That same afternoon, Gravel was ordered to push on, across the bridge, over the Perfume River, and into the Citadel, to reach General Truong's surrounded headquarters on the far bank. Golf Company, under a captain named Charles Meadows, started across the long span under a storm of fire. They got out onto the bridge, into the open middle of it, and could not cross. They were thrown back, and it cost them in a few minutes something like 10 men killed and 50 more wounded. The bridge was the lesson of the first day written large. The city could not be relieved by small forces thrown at it head-on. The far bank could not simply be walked to. And the Marines were fighting in those first days, with one hand tied. Because Hugh was a holy city, the old imperial capital, they were ordered at first not to call in heavy air or artillery, and not to fire the tank's main guns for fear of wrecking the monuments. They had their mortars and their rifles and little else, and the low monsoon cloud kept the aircraft on the ground in any case. So the first day ended with a foothold and a hard education. The Marines held a corner of the south bank, and a road behind them that closed again almost as fast as it opened. The river still lay between them and the fortress, and the flag still hung over the tower on the far side. They would have to learn this city block by block, and they were only at the beginning of it. And while they dug in on their southern beachhead, counted the cost of the bridge, on the other side of the river, inside the captured city, another kind of war was already underway. Quieter, out of sight, with no gunfire to mark it, and its own long reckoning still to come. By the morning of the 31st of January, the flag was up over the tower. The bridges were being fought for, and the guns were turning toward the river. But behind the walls of the captured city, in the streets, the fighting had already passed through. Another kind of war had begun. It had no front line, and it made very little sound. When the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong took Hue, they did not only take ground. They brought an administration with them, a temporary government for a city they intended to keep. And that administration had come prepared. The political department for the region, Tri Thien Hue, had issued a directive dated the 26th of January, and it set the task in plain words: to break apart and disorganize the administrative machinery of the South. In the occupied quarters, the new authorities went to work from lists they had drawn up in advance. The list named categories of people: soldiers of the South Vietnamese Army, civil servants and local officials, members of political parties, religious figures, school teachers, American civilians, and other foreigners the holiday had caught in the city. In quarter after quarter, loudspeakers called residents by name and told them to report, usually to a local school. And those who did not come were sought out at their homes. Many of those who reported, and many who were taken from their houses, were led away. It was described as a short interview, a brief re-education, a matter of a few days. A great number of them did not come back. Exactly how many were taken is one of the things still disputed, and it is bound up with all the other numbers this chapter has to hold. That is nearly all that can be said with certainty about the weeks the city spent under occupation. There were no reporters in the occupied quarters and few witnesses who left an account. What is known is the shape of it, the directive, the lists, the names read out, the people who went away, and then a long silence for as long as the enemy held the city. The rest is what was found afterward, when the fighting finally moved on. and Hugh began to search for the people it had lost. The graves were found in waves over almost 2 years. In the first months after the battle, through 1968 and into the beginning of 1969, searchers uncovered hidden burials, hasty, shallow ground, in courtyards and gardens and along the base of the city walls, holding around 1,200 bodies, spread across some 18 places. In February of 1969, a list of 428 identified names was made public, and families read down it looking for their own. In September of 1969, 3 men who had crossed over led searchers to a mountain stream about 10 miles south of the city, a place called Damai Creek. Along a stretch of perhaps 100 yards lay the remains of several hundred more. That November, another large burial came to light on the salt flats at Phu Thu, near the fishing village of Luong Vien, about 10 miles east of Hue, and in the Giahoi quarter, in the courtyard of a school. One of the first of these places had already been found at the end of February, as the district was being cleared. The finding went on like that for the better part of 2 years. A stream in the hills, a salt flat by the sea, a garden, a wall, each one reported, opened, and counted. It was slow, and it was terrible, and it was mostly done by people looking for someone in particular. What the searchers assembled, in the end, was not a story but a ledger, a set of places on the map, and beside each place a number. How many people died in those weeks is a question that is still argued over, and it may never have a single answer. The graves opened across 1968 and 1969 gave up around 2,800 bodies. The South Vietnamese government's own accounting named a larger figure: 4,062 people killed or carried off and never returned. Broader estimates run higher still, toward 6,000, something on the order of 5 to 10% of everyone who had been living in the city. The lowest estimates of some researchers reach only into the hundreds. The ways of counting differ, whether one counts only the bodies recovered, or adds the missing or folds in those killed by the fighting and the shelling. And so the totals differ with them. A historian would later put it as carefully as it can be put: we may never know exactly what happened at Hue, but it is clear that mass executions took place. Here it is enough to name what was found: the places, the dates, the number of graves. For the city, all of this lay ahead, in the ground, waiting to be found. In those first days of February, it was simply quiet behind the walls. In the quarters, the war had already crossed. The lists were being read out over the loudspeakers. The rest of Hue held its breath. And while that silence settled over the occupied streets on the south bank of the river, the men who would one day have to fight their way back into them were still learning, block by block, how to take a city at all. The Marines coming up from Phu Bai had a problem that no one wanted to say out loud. They did not know how to do this. They were good infantry, as good as any in the world at fighting through jungle and hills and paddy. But a city was a different animal, and the American military had spent almost 20 years forgetting how to fight in one. The last time Marines had cleared a great city street by street was Seoul, in September of 1950. The men who had done it were mostly gone from the ranks now, and the skill had gone with them. There had been no serious training for it, no doctrine anyone kept fresh. The battalions rolling toward Hue were about to relearn, in a matter of days, a kind of war they had never been taught. And the tuition would be paid, as it always is, by the youngest leaders first. The man who would teach much of it was a lieutenant colonel named Ernest Cheatham, who commanded the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Before the Corps, he had been a professional football player, a big man, a lineman, and he still had the size and the flat certainty of one. He had no more experience of city fighting than anyone else in his battalion. What he had back at Phu Bai was a footlocker. It was the battalion's chest of field manuals, the kind of thing a unit hauls from post to post and never opens. Cheatham dug through it and pulled out 2 thin books on the one subject he suddenly needed: fighting in built-up areas and attacking a fortified position. They were old manuals, some of the material going back to the last Great War, doctrine the Corps had written down and then set aside. He sat with them and he read. Picture that for a moment. A former football player, a battalion commander, sitting under a lamp at Phu Bai on the eve of the worst fighting of his life, reading a yellowed textbook about how to take a city, because that textbook held the memory his own service had misplaced. The Army had put the lesson in a book in 1944. Now, a generation later, a Marine was taking it back out of the box. The book said several plain things, and the plainest was the most important. Stay out of the streets. A street is a shooting gallery. Every doorway and every window along it has already been sighted by someone waiting for you to step into the open. So you do not use the doors, and you do not use the windows. You go through the walls. You blow a hole in the side of a building with an engineer charge or a recoilless rifle, and you go in where no one is aiming, and then you cross to the next building through another hole, and the next, moving through the insides of the block instead of along its face. A house stopped being a house. It became a corridor of holes. That idea reorganized everything, including what the Marines carried. Once he understood how the fight had to work, Cheatham had his people gather up every weapon at Phu Bai that could break a wall or clear a room. The list reads like an inventory of a strange, heavy trade. There were the 106mm recoilless rifles, big single shotguns that could punch through masonry. There were the Ontos, small, light-tracked vehicles, each mounting 6 of those 106mm recoilless rifles in a row, so that one Ontos could throw a salvo that took the corner clean off a building. There were the 3.5-inch rockets, the old bazookas for shorter work. There were mortars. There were the M48 tanks, and there was gas. Riot control CS gas, fired from launchers that held dozens of grenades apiece, along with the masks the Marines would need to follow it in. The Ontos was a particular favorite and a particular liability. It was more nimble than a tank and narrow enough to work its way into streets a tank could not. And its 6 barrels made it murderous against a fixed position, but it drew fire like a magnet, and there were never many of them. So they were saved and spent carefully, rolled up for a single deliberate shot, then pulled back before the enemy could range them. The Marines learned the small grammar of it as they went. An M48 firing at a reinforced wall did better with concrete piercing rounds, fused to bite in before they burst. A 3.5-inch rocket aimed straight at a window mostly wasted itself in an empty room. Aimed instead at the base of the opening or just below the sill, it caught the men who were crouched below the ledge where they thought they were safe. These were not things in the manual. They were things you worked out on the 2nd building and remembered for the 200th. And then there was the sequence, the drill that would carry them across the south of the city. Against a strong building, the Marines would first pour in the gas. Dozens of CS rounds through the windows, filling the rooms. Then, under the covering racket of everything at once: rifles, rockets, mortars, the tank's main gun. The assault team would pull on their masks and go in through the blown wall, room by room, until the building was theirs. It was slow, and it was loud, and it worked. The provincial treasury, a strong point the enemy had packed with men, would fall in a matter of hours to exactly this method. The gas turned out to be one of the sharpest tools they had, for a blunt reason. Most of the North Vietnamese soldiers holding the buildings had no masks. A room that a Marine could enter behind a rubber facepiece was, for the men already inside it, a room with no air. It did not win the fight, but it lowered the price of every doorway. And in a city, the price of every doorway was the whole account. So the battalion stopped attacking the way infantry attacks in the open. They built themselves into little combined arms machines. Riflemen, plus recoilless rifles, and an ontos, plus a tank, plus gas, plus engineers with their charges, and they went at the city as a system, one building, one block, one wall at a time. Not a charge down a street, a method. A school had opened in Hue, and it ran for a single term. The instructors were 2 forgotten manuals, and the men who died at the first few doorways. By the time the lesson was learned, the students would be able to take a city apart brick by brick. And the next 10 days would ask exactly that of them. The treasury, the post office, the hospital, the prison, one wall at a time. Early on the 1st of February, General LeHue gave the order that turned the fight into the grinding thing it would be remembered as. Clear the south bank of the river. It sounded like a large task, and it was, and the force he had to do it with was almost comically small for the job. 2 understrength Marine companies, 4 M48 tanks, an army truck with 4 heavy machine guns bolted together in the back, a pair of Vietnamese light tanks, and overhead, the same low-gray ceiling of drizzle that had grounded the aircraft and blinded the artillery since the battle began. No planes, no big guns, just men, and the walls in front of them. The first wall that mattered was the University of Hue. On the 2nd of February, Golf Company of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines went at the main university building, on the corner where Highway 1 met Laloy Street. It was a good building for the enemy and a bad one for the Marines. Tall, solid, and sitting right over the approaches to the river bridge and the little landing park where helicopters had to come in. The North Vietnamese had packed it. It took the better part of a day. The lead Marines did not get inside until 2:45 in the afternoon. But when it was theirs, the drill that Cheatham had pulled out of the footlocker had passed its first real test, and the battalion had a doorway into the rest of the South City. From the university, they turned on the treasury and the post office. These were strong points, thick government buildings full of men. And they did not fall to a rush. The Marines took them the slow way, the way they were learning. 5 or 6 separate assaults. Gas poured in through the windows. Masks on, in through a hole blown in the wall. Room by room, until the firing stopped. A building a day, sometimes less. The city was not measured in miles now. It was measured in blocks, and some days in a single house. This was the rhythm the men would live inside for a week. Blow a hole in the wall. Throw in what you had. Cross into the room beyond. Clear it, and start on the next wall. There is a strange grammar to fighting like that. The street becomes a thing to be avoided. The courtyard becomes the safe road. The inside of the block becomes the map. If you had walked those quarters a month earlier, you would have seen shop fronts and doorways in a normal town. Now the Marines read the same quarters backward as a set of walls with holes to be made in them, and the front door of every building was the one place no one would ever go. By the evening of the 4th of February, 4 Marine companies had pushed several blocks westward in a single day, spending rockets and recoilless fire and gas to do it. And that same evening, out on Highway 1, the enemy answered in his own grammar. North Vietnamese sappers finally dropped the An Q Bridge, the little span that carried the only road from Phu Bai into the city. Until engineers could bridge the gap again, everything and everyone coming into the south of Hue would have to come by helicopter or by boat. On the 5th of February, the Marines reached the city hospital and took its main building at 4:30 in the afternoon, clearing another block or two along the waterfront as they went. That mattered for more than the ground. As the captured stretch of riverbank grew, a Navy landing craft was at last able to nose up to the ramp for the first time since the battle began. Under heavy fire from the great southeastern wall of the citadel across the water. But there, the river, the city's oldest road, was open a crack. The 6th of February was the Treasury's harder cousins, the provincial headquarters of Thua Thien, and the prison. The Marines fed gas into the government building against defenders who, once again, had almost no masks, and fought through it into the middle of the day before both places were theirs. When they went through the captured papers afterward, they found what the building had been to the other side. The provincial administration of Hue had been serving for the past week as the command post of an entire North Vietnamese regiment. And it is here, in the small courtyard of that headquarters on the 6th of February, that the thread running through this whole battle shows itself again. Since the first morning, since the 31st of January, an enemy flag had flown over the tower of the citadel across the river. The great banner that the whole city could see from either bank, the prize everyone was really fighting for. The Marines who took the province headquarters could not reach that flag. It was over the wall, weeks away. But there was a flagpole here, in this courtyard, with the enemy's colors on it. And so, tired and filthy and elated, they hauled the enemy flag down from the pole and ran up the stars and stripes in its place. It was a small thing. It was one pole in 1 yard in the ruined south of the city. A CBS camera crew was there and filmed it, and it went out to living rooms an ocean away. A few seconds of exhausted men and a rising flag, standing in for a battle far too large and too grim to show. One flag down, one flag up, in a courtyard the size of a garden. The other flag, the one on the tower, would fly for 18 days more. The next morning, the 7th, the enemy admitted in the plainest way he could that the south bank was lost. His sappers blew the Nguyen Huang Bridge over the river, the last one still standing, so that the Marines could not cross it to come at the citadel wall, and the surviving North Vietnamese battalions began pulling back westward, over the Phu Cam Canal, out of the new city. When an army destroys the bridge behind itself, it is telling you where it thinks the fight has gone. What was left was the slow work of making sure. Through the 8th, 9th, and 10th of February, the Marines combed the triangle of the southern city for the ones who had stayed behind. The single riflemen, the small clinging groups, dug into the last few buildings. On the 10th, help finally arrived. A battalion of the 101st Airborne came up to Phu Bai and took over some of the ground, which let La Hue shift Marine companies deeper into the city. That same day, the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines seized the city stadium and turned it into a second landing zone, safer than the little park by the river, a place to bring the wounded out and the supplies in. By then the south bank was, in the main, cleared. It had taken 10 days, and it had been paid for a wall at a time. The men who had learned the city out of a footlocker manual had now written the rest of the book themselves, in the streets. They had a method that worked, and the scars to prove it worked, and for the first time since the last night of January, there was a stretch of Hugh where a Marine could stand up straight in daylight without a wall in front of him. Across the river, though, the citadel still stood, and the flag still flew over its tower. That fight was only waiting, but the men on the south bank did not have to think about it yet. For a day or two, in the wet gray quiet of a city they had just taken back, they could stop, set down the load, find a dry corner, and simply be tired. By the 10th of February, the fighting on the south bank had mostly moved on. The blocks around the university, the treasury, the hospital, the provincial headquarters, taken one wall at a time, had gone quiet in the particular way a place goes quiet after a battle. Not peaceful, just emptied of its noise. And into that emptiness, all through those days, the people of Hugh came looking for somewhere to wait out the rest of the war. They had lost almost everything. Of the roughly 140,000 people who had lived in Hugh before Tet, the great majority were now without a home, and much of the city lay in ruins. Some fled south, behind the lines, in long wet columns. Others simply moved inward, into houses that still had a roof, into churches, into the old pagodas, trusting that whatever else the war destroyed, it might spare those. More than anywhere, they gathered at the university. The main buildings on the south bank, half finished and already famous as a battlefield, became a shelter almost by accident. Families crowded into the courtyards and the bare concrete rooms. Old men, women, children, many of them under the wide conical hats, the non-law that a whole country wears against sun and rain. They had brought what they could carry. They waited. For a city with nothing left, the things that mattered now were small and enormous at once: food, clean water, and someone to look at the wounded. That last job fell, more often than not, to the Navy corpsmen, the medics who went everywhere the Marines went, carrying an aid bag instead of a rifle. They worked under the same fire as the riflemen, and they did not much distinguish between the people they treated. One photograph from those days shows a corpsman they called Doc, Dennis Howie, bent over a wounded Marine, a young private named David Crum, doing the plain, patient work of keeping a man alive. The same hands that bandaged a Marine in the morning would bandage a civilian in the afternoon. In the ruined city, that was as close as anyone came to neutral ground. The Marines themselves lived in the wreckage between fights, and they learned to travel light. Veterans remember stripping down to almost nothing, just ammunition and grenades, because everything else was weight you did not need in a house-to-house fight. They slept in broken buildings, on floors that were never quite dry. To reach a rooftop firing position, they would climb 6 meters or more up a drain pipe, then haul their rocket launchers up after them on ropes, hand over hand. They ate sea rations cold out of the can, and over all of it, day after day, hung the kraken, the fine monsoon drizzle, the low gray cloud, the damp cold that got in under wet cloth and stayed there. Men that tired develop a particular kind of humor. Dry, sideways, aimed mostly at the absurdity of their own orders. The objectives on the map came with tidy institutional names, and the names struck the men as ridiculous. One corporal, a squad leader named Meadows, is remembered for the way he answered when he was handed his assignments. Told his people were to take the treasury, he asked, more or less, what the hell a treasury even was. Told the next objective was the yacht club. He wanted to know what in the hell a yacht club was doing in the middle of all this. Nobody was really asking for an answer. It was just a way of saying that the world had stopped making sense some time ago, and you might as well laugh at it. And now and then the city gave something back. On the position of a Marine named McMahon, the story goes, a French resident of Hugh appeared out of the ruins carrying a bottle of cognac. He came not once, but twice. There was no ceremony to it. The bottle went from hand to hand down the line of men, a swallow each, no more, and then it was gone. And the war went on. If you have ever been cold and frightened and very far from home, you know exactly how much a single mouthful of something warm can be worth. The men who were there remembered that bottle for the rest of their lives. It is worth stopping in the quietest chapter of this story to remember that the same cold and the same rain fell on the other side. Out in the city and in the villages to the west sat the soldiers of the north, men who had slipped into Hugh over months and were now dug into its houses, low on food, soaked through, most of them without so much as a gas mask against the tear gas the Marines were learning to use. They were not a faceless mass. They were young men in wet holes, a few streets away, enduring the same February. The battle would go on grinding both of them down. But for a moment in the drizzle, exhaustion was the one thing everyone in Hugh had in common. The wounded had to be gotten out, and getting them out was its own quiet ordeal. In the early days, the helicopters came in low to a small park by the river. Dock Lao, a cramped, exposed patch of ground that everyone disliked and everyone used, because there was nothing better. Then, on the 10th of February, the Marines took the city stadium, and it became a second landing zone, safer than the park, tucked a little further from the guns. These same places where the wounded went out were where the food and the ammunition came in. The threads of survival all ran through a handful of open squares, and the men learned every one of them by heart. So this was Hugh in the middle of February, a city mostly in pieces under a sky that would not clear, full of people simply trying to last. And inside all that wreckage there were these small pockets of stillness, a courtyard full of families waiting, a corpsman's steady hands, a bottle passed down a line of soldiers, a joke that made no sense and helped anyway. Islands of quiet is what they were. Not safety, not rest exactly, just places, a few meters wide, where for a little while a person could be tired and human, and not much else while the battle held its breath around them. The rain kept falling, and beyond the ruined blocks, out on the river and out in the hills to the west, other men were fighting a slower, colder battle. Not for the houses of Hugh, but for the roads and the water that fed it. Every besieged city lives or dies by its lifelines. And Hugh had two kinds. There were the roads and the river that carried men and ammunition into the Marines. And there were the hidden roads, out in the western hills, that carried men and ammunition into the enemy. For most of February, the battle for Hugh was also a quiet contest over these threads. One side trying to keep its own lifelines open and to close the others. The river came first. Hugh's real port was a simple concrete ramp on the Perfume River, about half a kilometer north of the MACV compound, and everything the city needed had once come across it. Now the Navy tried to bring it back to life, Landing craft, the flat, heavy LCUs of a unit called the 329th Heavy Boats, pushed up from the sea from the river mouth at Tan Mai, loaded with food and ammunition. From the first bend past Tan Mai, they ran a gauntlet. Fire from both banks, mortars, recoilless rifles. The enemy understood exactly what these boats were and worked to cut the thread. Several of the craft were sunk or badly shot up before they ever reached the ramp. But the LCU was a hard thing to kill, ugly, slow, a steel box with a ramp for a bow, and very hard to sink. Not until the 5th of February, when the Marines had cleared enough of the bank, could the first boat finally come alongside the Hue ramp at all. And even then it did so under heavy fire from the southeast wall of the citadel. On the 12th, one of these boats crossed the Perfume loaded with tons of ammunition and more than 100 Marines standing on its deck. A single well-placed shell would have been a catastrophe. It never came. The river stayed open. The land route was harder to hold. The only road from the base at Phu Bai up to Hue ran across a modest arched bridge on Highway 1, the An Khu Bridge, over the Phu Cam Canal. On the first night of the offensive, a 20-man sapper team had been sent to drop it and had failed. Local regional forces had wiped the team out, and the bridge survived. The bridge lived on borrowed time. On the evening of the 4th, as the last chapter told, the engineers finally succeeded, and the last unbroken land thread between Phu Bai and Hue was gone. Until it could be replaced, the southern city hung on helicopters and riverboats alone. The fix was slow and improvised. On the 10th of February, reinforcements coming up the highway simply dismounted at the wrecked bridge and walked across on foot. Engineers laid a pontoon bridge beside the broken span about 4 days later, around the middle of the month, and only then did the convoys roll freely between Phu Bai and Hue again. Overhead, the weather refused to help. The Kraken grounded the aircraft for days at a stretch, and the first really heavy airstrike of the battle did not come until the 12th of February. Air Force F-100s and 11s bombing blind by radar from high altitude, putting tons of bombs and napalm onto a cluster of villages west of the city. Impressive, and not at all the same as a precise strike on a bunker. Those villages were where the other battle was being fought, the one to close the enemy's lifeline, to choke off the North Vietnamese from the west, where their reinforcements and supplies were coming from. The American command released the 1st Cavalry Division, the Great Airmobile Division, and gave the job to its 3rd Brigade under Colonel Campbell. On the 2nd of February, under low cloud, helicopters lifted a single battalion, the 2nd of the 12th Cavalry, about 400 men under Lieutenant Colonel Richard Sweet, out to an old post northwest of the city called PK-17. Their packs with the ponchos and sweaters never arrived. The men spent a miserable cold night in the mud and then started for Hue. On the 3rd of February, Sweet's battalion worked its way to a pair of villages, Thon Quay Chu and Thon La Chu, an island of trees about 4 kilometers west of the citadel. What they did not know was what sheltered there. The enemy's Hue City front headquarters and battalion after battalion of North Vietnamese regulars, some of them just arrived by forced march from Khe Sanh. Sweet took the first village in a frontal attack, 9 of his men killed, 48 wounded that day, and then found his battalion surrounded, 3 times outnumbered, by a better armed enemy. The next morning brought another assault against them, 11 more killed, 51 wounded. What Sweet did that night became one of the strangest small episodes of the war. Unwilling to fall back without finishing the job, he took his battalion not backward, toward safety, but deeper, into the enemy's own rear, toward a hill to the southwest called Nan Han, from which he could bring fire down on the North Vietnamese moving into Hue. In the dark, the column threaded a gap barely 75 meters wide in the enemy line. Enemy sentries, taking the shapes in the fog for their own men, actually shone flashlights to guide them through. And at one point, a full North Vietnamese column, marching toward the citadel, passed within a few steps of the Americans in the darkness. And both sides went by each other in silence, in the fog, without ever knowing. Behind them, the guns of PK-17 and two ships offshore, the cruiser Northampton and the destroyer Lofberg, covered the ground they left. From the hill, Sweet's men began doing exactly what they had come to do, calling artillery and naval gunfire down on the enemy columns moving into the city. After that, the North Vietnamese stopped using the roads to Hue by daylight. The battalion was kept alive by helicopters flying in under fire, their crews kicking supply crates out on low passes rather than landing at all. And this is worth saying plainly, against any idea of a neat 5-day fight. The struggle for that island of trees was not a matter of days. For nearly 3 weeks the enemy held on to the villages west of the citadel, and only on the 21st of February were they finally driven out. By then the noose had been drawn tight and slow. Through the middle of February the cloud kept the aircraft down, and the frontal attacks on the villages kept failing at a cost. But the pressure was constant. On the 16th, General Abrams named the cutting of the enemy supply route west of the citadel the priority, and by the 20th, Campbell had 4 battalions in hand instead of 1. At dawn on the 21st of February, Campbell threw 3 of them at Thon Quay Chu and Thon La Chu at once. Behind smoke, with 40-millimeter dusters and demolition charges. This time the line broke. By late afternoon, the North Vietnamese, a regiment and more, including a regiment that had also come down from Khe Sanh, abandoned the villages and slipped away toward Hue under the cover of the fog. The day cost the enemy 89 dead and 2 taken prisoner. It cost the Americans 4 dead and 77 wounded. A prisoner said there had been nearly 1,000 North Vietnamese in the village. With the villages gone, the western door was shut. Over the next days, the cavalry battalions pressed on toward the citadel, pinning the enemy's remnants against a canal to the west, where, as one account put it, the North Vietnamese drained out of the citadel like water through a hole in a bucket. Cut off now from supply and reinforcement, the garrison inside the old fortress began, at last, to fail. But it had not failed yet. Across the river behind the ancient walls, the North Vietnamese were still dug in, and there, on a stretch of rampart wide enough to hold houses, the Marines still had the tightest, hardest mile of the whole battle in front of them. The last chapter left you at the narrowest ground of the whole battle. Here it is. Across the Perfume River, on the northern bank, stood the citadel, the square fortress of the Nguyen emperors, its earthen ramparts faced in brick, its wide moat lying gray under the rain. For nearly 2 weeks the fighting had been on the southern bank, in the new city, house by house. But the fortress itself, the old heart of Hue, had never been retaken. By the 12th of February, nearly all of it still belonged to the North Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese held only the northeastern corner. General Truong's headquarters at Mong Ca, and a thin length of the wall. Every gate, every courtyard, The inner palace at its center, all of it lay in other hands, under the strange flag that had hung over the flag tower since the first morning of the battle. Now the job that no one had wanted came due. Someone had to cross the river and fight inside the walls themselves. The battalion sent for it was the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, under Major Robert Thompson. On the morning of the 12th, they came into the citadel the only ways left open. Part of the battalion by air, lifted in by helicopter to Truong's compound in the corner. The rest by river, brought up on Navy landing craft to a ferry landing at the northern tip of the fortress. Then they gathered themselves inside a captured city and turned to face the wall they had been given. And what a wall it was! The stretch handed to the Marines ran along the northeast face of the citadel, some 2,500 yards of it, a rampart about 20 feet high, and in places anywhere from 50 to 200 feet thick. That last number is the one to sit with. This was not a wall in the ordinary sense, not a line you could lean a ladder against. It was a raised mound of earth as wide as a city block, and built into its thickness were houses, bunkers, firing positions, and tunnels. A whole fortified street lifted 20 feet into the air. The men who raised it centuries ago had meant it to hold archers and honor guards. Now it held machine guns, and every yard of it would have to be taken one at a time. Thompson's plan was to attack southeast along that wall, pushing the enemy ahead of him down toward the river, where, in theory, they would be caught between his battalion inside the citadel and the Marines still working the southern bank. It was a clean idea on a map. On the ground, it meant walking into the thickness of the wall itself, into rooms built for a different century, and taking them back from men who had spent 2 weeks learning every angle of them. For that first day, the Marines fought with one hand tied. The old restrictions still held. Hugh was a sacred city, the seat of emperors, and its monuments were to be spared. Then, on the evening of the 12th, the Vietnamese Corps commander, General Lam, lifted it, releasing what the orders called any available weapon against the citadel, with a single exception: the imperial palace at its very heart. Only then did the heavy fire come into it. Artillery, the naval guns firing from the river, airstrikes on the rare hours the cloud lifted. The city that both sides had spared for a century and a half was, at last, going to be fought for in full. The lesson of the wall came on the very first morning of the assault, when Company Alpha rose to attack along the open top of the rampart. And the rampart, within minutes, made the cost of that plain. It set the measure of the place, not miles in a day, yards for a building. From then on, the battalion went not along the wall but through it, room by room inside the mound of earth, opening one wall to reach the next, digging the defenders out of spaces that had been made for archers. The strongest point on that whole face was the Dong Ba Gate, a squat tower rising above the eastern wall, the highest ground in the sector and the most heavily held. The fight for it ran across 3 days, the 13th to the 15th of February. On the 15th, Company Delta led the assault, with Charlie covering the flank and Bravo feeding in behind. After some 6 hours, the Marines held the base of the gate, and then the gate itself. The day's cost, on both sides of the brick, was out of all proportion to the ground it bought. By the time they took it, the tower was no longer a tower. It was a heap of broken brick that happened to command the wall, and a heap of broken brick can be lost as easily as it is won. In the small hours of the next morning, the North Vietnamese came back, and the tower changed hands once more in the dark. Two sergeants, Bob Toms and Selwyn Tate, led the way back up through the rubble, and a platoon under Lieutenant Jack Imla sealed the wall behind it. By the gray first light, after hours of slow, patient work, the tower stayed marine. One pile of rubble and a whole night's work to keep it. That was the arithmetic of the citadel, repeated the length of the wall. In a single week of it, Thompson's battalion took more than 300 casualties. Companies that had crossed the river near full strength were worn down to the size of a platoon. A captain's command shrunk to what a lieutenant might lead. The rifle squads thinned, took in replacements, and thinned again. There were no clean gains to point to on a map. There was only the next room, the next firing slit, the next few feet of an old wall, and on the other side of that foot of masonry were men in much the same state. The North Vietnamese who held the wall had come into the city weeks earlier and had been fighting and dying in it ever since. Short of food now, short of ammunition, cut off more each day from the country behind them, holding the Emperor's fortress against everything the weather would let the Marines bring to bear. They had no masks against the gas, no aircraft overhead, no easy way out. They were being ground down inside the same whetstone, in the same cold, at the same slow rate. Two exhausted battalions, a foot of brick apart, spending each other 1 yard at a time. Over all of it lay the weather that had shaped the whole battle. The low Kraken cloud sat on the city day after day, keeping the aircraft grounded for much of the fight, wetting the brick and the men alike. Tanks and the small tracked Ontos were brought up close to fire into the wall at short range. The rest was rifles, grenades, and the strange intimacy of fighting an enemy on the other side of a foot of masonry. It was slow, and it was cold, and it was measured in a currency the men had stopped questioning. A yard of wall, and what it took to hold it. Yard by yard, the battalion ground southwest along the rampart, toward the corner where the enemy was drawing in on itself, toward the imperial palace and the flag tower that stood beside it. Over that tower a banner had hung since the first gray morning of the battle, in plain view of both banks of the river. It had flown there now for more than 3 weeks. Ahead lay the last few hundred yards of the fortress, and the morning that flag would finally come down. The last few hundred yards took the rest of the battle. By the 21st and 22nd of February, Thompson's Marines had worked their way down the northeast wall to the southwest, and the North Vietnamese still inside the citadel were pressed into a shrinking corner of it. The Imperial Palace and the southwest bastion, the innermost ground of all. In the small hours of the 22nd at 3 in the morning, Company Alpha moved through the dark and took a block of buildings the enemy had held for weeks and found them nearly empty. The defense was coming apart from the inside, cut off from supply and from reinforcement by the ring tightening in the country to the west. The garrison of the citadel had begun to slip away in the nights. That collapse had its cause out beyond the walls, where the cavalry's long fight in the west had at last closed the ring. The men holding the citadel were fighting now on what they had carried in with them, with no more coming. And in the nights, they began to slip away toward the canals to the southwest. What Thompson's Marines felt as empty rooms in the dark was an army being starved out of a city. Around 1 o'clock that afternoon, a small party of Alpha Marines under Lieutenant Pat Polk worked into a corner bastion of the wall and ran up an American flag over it. It was a private thing, a handful of exhausted men marking a piece of ground they had bled for, and not the changing of the flag over the city. That still hung where it had hung since the first morning, the great banner of the National Liberation Front, over the flag tower called Kai Dai, on the central axis of the fortress, facing the river. By the end of that day, the enemy held only the palace and the southwest angle. The rest of the citadel was back. It is worth stopping on that flag, because in a way, the whole battle had been a fight for it. Kai Dai is the tallest flagstaff in Vietnam, and it stands on the spine of the citadel, in full view of both banks of the Perfume River. Whatever flew from it could be seen from the southern city, from the walls, from the water, by every soldier and every civilian on either shore. It was not a weapon, it commanded no ground, but it was the one thing everyone could see, and so it had become the prize of the whole grim game of capture the flag, the visible heart of the battle. That was why the last corner of the fortress was defended longest of all. Not for the palace stones, for what stood beside them against the sky. It came down at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 24th of February. Soldiers of the South Vietnamese 1st Division lowered the enemy banner, a piece of cloth the size of a small house, some 600 square feet of it, that had flown over Kai Dai since the dawn of the 31st of January. 24 days it had hung there, seen from both shores, the single image that held the whole battle together. In its place, they raised the flag of the Republic of Vietnam. By mid-morning, the southern wall was secured. The strange flag that had opened the story was, at last, taken down. The imperial palace itself fell that same day, and it fell to men of the city. General Truong gave the task of retaking the imperial city to the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Regiment and to the reconnaissance company that had fought through the entire battle. The Hak Bao, the Black Panthers, the division's elite. Their commander was a captain named Tran Ngoc Hue, and he had been born in this city. He carried its name. His men had helped open the battle here, retaking the airfield inside the citadel in the first days. Now they closed it, moving into the imperial city against almost no resistance, for the enemy had gone into the night ahead of them. By the evening of the 24th, the palace of the emperors was back in Vietnamese hands. A man had walked into the city he was born in, room by room, and found it, at the end, gone quiet. The fighting did not stop all at once. It guttered out, the way a long fire does. Early on the 25th, the last pocket of North Vietnamese in the southwest angle of the citadel was cleared by the 4th Vietnamese Marine Battalion, and with that, the main battle inside the walls was over. East of the citadel, across a narrow channel of water, lay Gia Hoi, a densely built quarter that had been longest of all under the front's administration. On the 22nd, South Vietnamese Rangers had crossed to it on wooden junks and begun working through it house by house. It was there, a few days later, that searchers first came upon what the occupation had left behind. But that belongs to another part of the story, and it will be told carefully when it comes. The guns fell quiet by degrees over the following days, until at last, on the 2nd of March, the American command declared the battle for Hue over. However you chose to count it, by the flag, by the guns, by the calendar, it had gone on for the better part of a month. The longest sustained battle inside a city that American forces had fought since Korea, a generation before. And then, for the first time in a month, Hue was quiet. It was not the quiet of the festival that the first rockets had broken, that warm, crowded, lantern-lit hush of the new year. It was a different quiet, thinner and colder, the silence of a place that has nothing left to make noise with. The rain still came down over the river. Smoke still rose here and there from the ruins. On the walls, men who had learned to count the days in yards sat down where they stood and slept, and for a long while no one fired at them, and they did not fire at anyone. For a month the city had been all sound, rockets and mortars, the crack of rifles off stone, the grind of tank engines, the loudspeakers of the occupation calling names into empty streets. Now there was the rain on the river, and little else. A boat somewhere on the water, a wall cooling in the gray light. The oldest capital in the country that the war had walked around for 150 years lay still. The battle was over. But a city is not the same thing as a battlefield, and when the shooting stops, someone has to count what it cost. The houses, the streets, the river crossings, and the people who had lived among them. That reckoning was only beginning. For the first time in a month, the city was quiet. Not the quiet of the festival, when Hugh had held its breath for the new year, waiting for the first hour of the calendar to turn. And not the quiet of the siege, when every silence was only the narrow space between one burst of fire and the next. This was a different stillness, the stillness of a place that had finally stopped being fought over. And into that stillness, slowly, the counting began. Every city keeps its accounts without anyone noticing. So many roofs, so many bridges, so many people who wake each morning in their own beds. Hugh had kept those accounts quietly for a century and a half, the way an old house keeps them without ever writing them down. Now in the first days of March, someone had to sit and read the ledger back, and the numbers were very large. Before Tet, about 140,000 people had lived in Hugh. When the fighting ended, something close to 116,000 of them had no home left to return to. 4 of every 5. Not driven from the countryside into the city, the way war usually moves people, but made homeless inside their own streets, standing on the ground where their houses had been that January. How much of the city was gone depended on who did the counting, and how. By some estimates, nearly half of Hugh had burned. By others, as much as 80% of its buildings were damaged or destroyed. Inside the citadel, the walled heart, the imperial quarter that the war had spared for 100 years, only a handful of the old buildings still stood whole. The rest were roofless or scorched or simply gone, folded back into the rubble of their own courtyards. The people moved the way people have always moved away from a ruined place, on foot along the roads, carrying what they could carry. Columns of them went south under the same gray drizzle that had hung over the whole battle, the kraken that never quite lifted. Many had been sheltering for weeks already. In the university on the south bank, in the pagodas and the churches, in any building whose walls they had trusted to hold. The university had become a camp almost by itself, its unfinished courtyards filling with families in conical hats, waiting out the noise. Now, on the edges of the city, the first resettlement camps went up. Rows of shelter, lines for rice, and everywhere the slow, patient work of people looking for their own. Because the first days after a battle are not really about rebuilding, they are about the smallest things. Clean water, a sack of rice, a doctor, a name called out and answered. Before anyone thought about walls and roofs, the city was busy with something quieter. The sorting of the living from the missing, the matching of one family to another, the long business of finding out who was still there. Some of that finding would go on in the hardest way for almost 2 years, but that belongs to an earlier chapter, and we only touch it here in passing. While the city counted itself, the war was being counted somewhere else, far across the ocean, in living rooms you would never see. In the middle of February, a familiar American face had come to Vietnam. Walter Cronkite, the anchor of the CBS Evening News for millions of Americans, simply the voice that told them each evening what the world had done that day. He had flown into Saigon around the 11th of February and traveled north, and around the 20th he came to Hue itself while the fighting for the citadel was still going on. There is film of him there, in a helmet, interviewing the commander of a Marine battalion, and then he flew out again by military helicopter and turned for home. On the 27th of February, late at night in New York, Cronkite went on the air with a half-hour report on what he had seen. For most of his career, he had kept his own opinions carefully out of the frame. This time, at the very end, he set the reporter aside and spoke for himself. The war, he said, seemed to him mired in stalemate. That was his phrase, and the only reasonable way out was to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who had done the best they could. He did not say that America had lost. He said only that victory was not on the horizon. From the most trusted man in the country, quietly at the close of the evening news, that was enough. They tell a story about what happened next. In the White House, the president, Lyndon Johnson, is said to have turned from the broadcast and told the room, "If I have lost Cronkite, I have lost Middle America." Whether he ever really said it, no one can prove. The line comes down to us wrapped in reportedly, and it is said, with no certain time or place attached to it. And Cronkite himself always waved his own influence away, calling the broadcast just one straw among many. Said or unsaid, it caught something true. The evening became a marker. The night, a great many Americans let themselves think, out loud, that the war might not be won. And that is the strange arithmetic of Hue. On the ground, the battle was a victory. The city retaken, the enemy driven out, the flag on the tower changed back at last. But the bill the city paid was read, in the end, on two different ledgers that would never agree. One counted ground held and objectives taken. The other counted something much harder to set a figure to. How much faith a nation still had that any of it would end the way it had been promised. Hue is the place where those two accounts came apart. The soldiers won the city, and somewhere over the ocean, at almost the same hour, the war was quietly being lost. The full price, the one written in names and numbers on every side of the wall, still had to be gathered up and added. That is the last accounting, and we come to it now gently, the way you close a long ledger at the end of a long day. So here, at the end, are the numbers. And numbers, read slowly, in a quiet voice, are their own kind of rest, not scenes, not the thing itself, only the weights, set down one at a time onto the two pans of a scale that never quite comes level. On the American side, the Marines who had fought their way up the highway and along the wall lost around 150 men killed and somewhere between 800 and 1,100 wounded. The tally shifts a little depending on which record you read and over how many days. The Army, fighting its own part of the battle, lost about 74 killed and some 500 wounded. Out to the west, in the wet hills around La Chaux, the cavalry that closed the loop around the city lost about 68 more, with over 400 wounded. The South Vietnamese, whose city it was, paid more than any of their allies. More than 400 of their soldiers were killed. The Army and the Vietnamese Marines counted together, and well over 2,000 wounded. They had begun the battle surprised and scattered, half of them away on leave for the festival. They ended it holding the citadel they had lost on the first night and taking back the palace at its center. And on the other side of the wall, the soldiers of the North and the Viet Cong battalions who had come into the city through the festival crowds. The number is the one no one has ever been able to settle. Their own captured record spoke of a little over 1,000 killed inside the city. Their army's later summary counted more than twice that. The Allied command counted more still, as many as 5,000 in and around Hue. How many young men from the North lie somewhere in that gap between 1,000 and 5,000? We will most likely never know. They had come a long way to a city most of them had never seen, and a great many of them did not leave it. And then there are the ones who were only ever at home. The people of Hue, those caught between the walls, and those who did not come back from being led away, are the heaviest weight on the scale and the hardest to fix in place. The estimates run from a few thousand into higher figures still. The graves found afterward held close to 2,800. The argument over how many and in what way has gone on for half a century. We gave them their own chapter earlier, quietly, and we will not open it again here. We only set them on the scale where they belong, the largest number and the least certain of all. Some of what was carried out of Hue was measured differently, not in the dead, but in citations and in medals that took their own long time to arrive. The units that fought their war afterward, the Presidential Unit Citation, the whole of their long effort gathered into a single ribbon. And out of all those days, 2 men received the Medal of Honor, the highest award the country gives. One was Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, Freddie to the men of his company, who had come up the highway with the very first relief column, and who went back into the fighting wounded again and again, from the last day of January into the first days of February, until he was killed, clearing a position that had his men pinned down. His medal was given to his family in his name in 1969. A Navy destroyer would later carry that name out to sea. The other took 50 years. First Sergeant John Canley had taken command of that same company when its captain fell on the road into the city and led it through Hue for the better part of a week, carrying wounded men to safety across open ground. For that, in 1970, he was given the Navy Cross. It was not until 2018, half a century after the battle, that the award was raised to the Medal of Honor, the 300th in the history of the Marine Corps, and the first ever given to a living black Marine. Sometimes the full weight of what a man has done takes longer to settle onto the scale than the war itself lasted. There is one more thing on the scale, and it is not a number at all. Hue changed the way armies think about cities. For 18 years, the American military had all but forgotten how to fight inside one. The last time had been Seoul in 1950, and in the years since, the skill had quietly rusted away. Hue forced it to be relearned in a single brutal month, at a terrible tuition paid mostly by young sergeants and corporals. What was learned there did not fade again. The combination that finally worked, the tanks and the little ontos, and the recoilless rifles and the gas and the infantry, all moving together, building by building, became doctrine. So did the harder lesson from the hills to the west. that a city cannot be taken from the inside alone, that it has to be sealed off from the outside first, its lifelines cut, before the fighting within can ever end. Soldiers still study Hugh. It sits in the field manuals and the war colleges as the case they keep returning to. A city that becomes, for a while, the center of an entire war. Seoul came before it. Fallujah and Mosul came long after, and each army that walks into a city seems to learn the same lessons over again, slowly, as if no one had ever written them down. Hugh is where the modern version of those lessons was written down. By the cold measure of the ground, the Allies had won. They held the city, and they had blunted the great offensive of that spring. And yet, as the last chapter said, the winning and the believing had come apart. Hugh was a victory that helped end a nation's certainty that victory was coming at all. So the scales are set, and they do not come level, and perhaps they were never meant to. That is where a battle leaves you, with two pans that will not balance, and a long quiet that asks what to do with them. There is an answer of a kind, and it is in none of these numbers. It waits downstream, in the city itself, in the walls that would be patched and the roofs that would be raised again, in the market that would open once more at first light, and in the river that had run through all of it, and never, for a single day, gone anywhere. The counting is finished now. The city is still there. And that is where we go, last of all. Back to Hugh, and back to the water, and the city is still there. That is the first thing to say, and the gentlest. Hugh was not erased. It was wounded, as badly as any city of its country, in that year of wounds. And then, slowly, over decades, it healed. In 1993, the old Imperial Quarter, the complex of Hugh monuments, became Vietnam's first World Heritage Site. The citadel and the palaces and the tombs along the river, recognized at last as belonging not to one side of anything but to everyone. The restorers have been at work there for most of a lifetime now. The Ngomon Gate stands again, the noon gate of the emperors, its roofs tiled and its reflection steady in the lotus moat. The throne hall has been raised and lacquered. The 9 great dynastic urns still stand in their courtyard, as they stood through everything. Inside the walls, the outlines of the forbidden purple city are being coaxed back, garden by garden, from the grass. Of all the imperial grounds of Vietnam, Hugh today is the best preserved, which is a quiet, remarkable sentence to be able to say about it at all. But walk close to the brick, and the city will tell you the other half of the story. On the walls and the old gates, the restorers left the bullet scars where they found them. Small pocked constellations in the masonry, kept on purpose. The fortress was healed, but not polished smooth. The stone is allowed to remember the emperors and to remember February of 1968, both at once, without choosing between them. In our own day, workers are still mending stretches of the great walls. A city like Hugh is never finished being repaired. It is only ever being kept. And around the old stones, the ordinary city goes on, the way it always meant to. The Dongba Market, burned in the fighting half a century ago, opens at first light on the north bank, in the shadow of the wall, the way it has for over 100 years. Fish and rice and vegetables, cloth and spice and cooking smoke, the small, loud business of a river town waking up. Dragon boats carry visitors along the perfume river in the evenings, with music on the water. It is the same water that divided the battle in two. The river never took a side, and it never went anywhere. It only kept flowing under the fog, under the fires, under the bridges as they fell, and as they were raised again, the whole time. Two kinds of memory live in Hugh now, side by side. For the men who fought there, on every side of those walls, it remains the hardest city of their lives. The place the textbooks still open to when soldiers study how cities are fought for. And for Vietnam it is the imperial capital again, the city of poets and tombs and pagoda bells, wearing its scars the way an old face wears its lines. Neither memory cancels the other. The city carries both, and the visitors come for both, and the flag tower stands over all of it, just a tower now, with its own country's flag, catching the light off the river at the end of the day. So let the story set itself down, one last time, gently. A city that the war walked around until one New Year's night it didn't. A flag at dawn, and 24 days. A mile of highway, a footlocker of old manuals, a wall as wide as a house. The rain that would not lift, the river that would not stop, the two islands that held. And then the long counting and the long healing and a market opening at first light beside a wall full of small, kept scars. It is dawn on the Perfume River now, in the city of Hugh, and the fog is on the water, the way it was on that last quiet night, the way it is almost every morning, war or no war. A boat noses out from the bank. The market lights come on, one by one, under the old wall. The tower stands in the mist. The city, which has seen everything, is simply beginning another day. And you can rest now. The long watch is over. The city sleeps, and so can you.